China is also sort of quite aggressively engaged with the global South, right? It's launched these bunch of new initiatives called the Civilization Initiative, Security Initiative, Development Initiative, and each of these are essentially targeted at wooing the global South by saying that, look, this old model that America represents no longer really works. We have a new model. The contours of that model are not unclear, are not necessarily entirely clear, but it's a model which gives everybody room to do everything. It's a model that respects diversity in international relations.
For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to The Gist on Strat News Global. Good evening, I'm Surya Gangadharan. We are looking this evening at the Blinken visit to China. US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was there, and by all accounts, his meetings appear to have gone off well from the reports that we read. I have a small graphic here underscoring some of the points that the Americans committed themselves to. He underscored US commitment to the One China policy, the need to avoid a new Cold War, no backing for Taiwan's independence, and US alliances are not directed at China. So that's some of the low-hanging fruit that the Americans were able to get out of Blinken. There's also a Chinese skepticism about US commitments, which played out in the Chinese press. As you're aware, the Chinese press is largely controlled by the state. So that shows how the Chinese state looks at US commitments. They're concerned about US curbs on China's high-tech industry. Sanctions of various kinds remain, and they're concerned about US assertion of leadership in the Indo-Pacific. Those are some of China's concerns, which have been articulated in their media. There's the likelihood of a Xi Jinping Biden summit, perhaps sometime at the APEC summit later this year. That's something which is on the table, no decisions as yet, which means that there could be some more movement forward. Let me bring in Manoj Kewalramani, head of Indo-Pacific research at the Takshashila Institution. He's also a China scholar. Manoj, good to have you again.
Thank you so much, Surya. Pleasure to be here.
So what's the big takeaway from the Blinken visit?
I think the big takeaway is that both sides are finally now engaged in formal negotiations. What we've seen over the last 6 months is that ever since the balloon incident happened in February, is that formal, structured negotiations broke down. We did have dialogue at the level of lower level officials and some informal conversations. But we weren't necessarily seeing cabinet level officials on either side engage. This trend started to shift in sometime in May, where we had a conversation between the Chinese foreign minister and the US ambassador. At that conversation, it ended by sort of putting a ribbon on the balloon incident, but also talking about how even China is quite interested in and places a top priority on stabilizing the relationship, which echoed what the US had been saying, that, look, we need to have some sort of guardrails. We need to have, if not guardrails, because that's a phrase that the Chinese don't appreciate because they see it as essentially containment, facilitating American containment. But at least we need to have some sort of responsible stakeholdership in managing this competition that we have. And the Chinese seem to echo that. At the same time, in that conversation, I remember Qin Gang had told Nicholas Burns that, I hope you have more conversations going forward. And then subsequently, he did meet the commerce minister and so on. And then you had the commerce minister travel to DC. He met with, the American Secretary of Commerce. And then you had a conversation between Wang Yi and US NSA Jake Sullivan. So that's led to this, gradual thaw where we've now finally seen Antony Blinken make this visit to China, which he was expected to make in February. So what's been achieved primarily, I think in Blinken's own words, what's been achieved is the fact that both sides are finally talking. You're likely to see much more conversation between different cabinet level officials. There will be many more trips by American cabinet level officials to China. Likewise, we're likely to see potentially Qin Gang visiting DC. although no date has been put to that so far. I think some of the low-hanging fruit that they've agreed upon is that they will have working group conversations on issues of, say, drug trafficking. The fentanyl issue in the US is quite sensitive. It affects American population, particularly the American youth. And the Chinese have agreed to talk on this. In fact, just prior to Blinken's visit, there was a formal dialogue between the departments engaged on this issue between China and the United States. So what we're seeing is that a gradual resumption of dialogue is taking place. One other breakthrough that we've seen is in terms of people-to-people connectivity. Both sides have said that we want to talk about how do we facilitate more flights and more people-to-people engagement, educational engagement, and all of that. This was all the non-controversial stuff necessarily, and I think that's what we've seen achieved. The more tricky issues, which is around, say, military to military communication, which the Americans have been pushing for, and Beijing has been resisting. We've seen no breakthrough on that. After Nancy Pelosi's visit last year to Taiwan, Beijing had suspended some of these dialogue mechanisms, and it's unwilling to restart, particularly the military to military dialogue mechanism. And it's unlikely that this will restart in the near term, partly because the Chinese defense minister, who took charge in March 2023, Li Shangfu, faces sanctions from America. He was placed under sanctions in 2018. These are CATSA sanctions. And the Americans are unlikely to yield on them. Beijing's argument has been that, look, if you want to meet and if you want to talk, you need to remove these sanctions. We need to talk as equals. The American argument is that the sanctions don't prevent us from talking. We can talk in third-party countries like Singapore, where they had an opportunity sometime back during the Shangri-La dialogue, but that didn't happen. So basically, what we've seen is some resumption of conversation, but the prickly issues remain.
So, assuming there's a summit-level meeting between Biden and Xi on the sidelines of APEC, you expect bigger things to happen? Logically,
I mean,
yes.
I think I mean, look, I think both sides would be wanting that, but there's a long way to go before we get to that summit, and for that to have some sort of meaningful outcomes. I think it's also important to keep in mind that by the time that summit takes place, is towards the end of this year, the US will also be sort of entering presidential election cycle in sort of full-fledged manner. So it becomes much more difficult to sort of give. But there are many areas where I think this visit tells us that there is scope for both sides to have a conversation. I mean, I talked about some of the low-hanging fruit that they've picked, but also if you look at things like climate change, if you look at things like, say, security in the Middle East, these are areas where I think there is a commonality of interest, and we might see some sort of deals being cut on this. I mean, for example, in the Middle East, a lot has been made about China brokering the peace agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But it's fair to say that the Americans have been sort of edged out in that deal. But I don't think the Americans necessarily look at that as fundamentally adverse to their interests. I mean, in fact, when Blinken was asked this in an interview with NPR, he was quite positive. I mean, despite taking some shots about China making this last minute entry and praising the fact that this dialogue had been going on for some time between Iran and Saudi Arabia, he does say that China can play a constructive role. He does say that if Beijing is willing to be engaged and if it's willing to be helpful, and it's important for countries like China to be engaged, then it's not necessarily a negative. Of course, the caveat is that when it comes to these issues, the Americans want to see engagement which is purposeful, which is, and I quote, which is just, and they want peace which is durable. So when they're talking about some of these things, they're also talking about the values that they want to uphold and the interests that they have. But it's not fundamentally hostile. So I think that there are areas in which both sides can work together, and they can cooperate. But there are severe differences that remain. On trade, I think Blinken's visit does tell us that there is some degree of commonality between the two sides. He talked about how there is $700 billion worth of trade that's going on, record levels of American investment is in China. Yet there is some degree of de-risking that is taking place. So that does tell you that there are interlinked interests. So my sense is that yes, both sides have an interest in trying to arrive at some sort of common understandings on how to manage the relationship. That would be the big thing that they'd want to work on. But getting there is going to be extremely difficult. And that's because of what I call the fundamental contradiction in how both of these sides are approaching this dialogue currently. The Americans are approaching this dialogue with the intent of trying to manage the competition that they see is evolving and will evolve in the years to come. Beijing is entering this dialogue by saying, look, this idea of major power competition and that prism, to apply that prism to view our relationship, is fundamentally flawed. We do not want to be engaged in such a relationship where you look at us as fundamentally a competitor and you look at our relationship as great power competition. You need to twist the prism and you need to look at us as a peer partner. And when you do that, that's when we can talk constructively about all of these issues. In fact, this is quite specifically what Xi Jinping told Antony Blinken in their meeting, right? Chinese state media quoted Xi Jinping as saying that, that major country competition does not represent the trend of the times, and it cannot solve America's problems. So I think that contradiction remains, and that's why this relationship is going to remain extremely fraught. I don't see any major breakthroughs in the years and months to come. In the months to come, going up to the APEC summit. In fact, if you look at what Blinken himself says after the meetings in the press conference that he addressed, he actually says that, look, one meeting, one event, one conversation, none of this is going to resolve our differences. And it's worth people thinking back to the fact that both sides describe this as the lowest point in the relationship since normalization. So to get back from there, it's a long, long way. And I don't think that we're going to get back to what it used to be. But if both sides can manage the tension so that it doesn't veer off into conflict, then that's beneficial to everybody.
So the fundamental course of the relationship is set. It is going to be adversarial, probably get worse as we go ahead. And really, all this is just trimmings.
I think all this is trying to find a way in which you can not end up having that adversarial competition end up into conflict. I think the fear is conflict.
Give each other time, really, for something else.
You're both buying time because, indeed, you're both buying time because you both need to continue to invest in your own development and your own capabilities. I mean, it's worth keeping in mind that we are in an era where technological changes are, there is revolutionary technological change taking place, which will define the drivers of future economic growth. And both sides want to be the first in doing that because they recognize that will give them a lot of authority in setting the trends going forward. At the same time, both are engaged in a narrative contest to try and shape the future order, future world order in some ways. But at the moment, to try and win over allies. Beijing is engaged in a narrative contest. Particularly in the last few months, it's been going extremely hard with Western European countries. The invitation to Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Scholz, Li Qiang today, the Chinese premier, is in Germany, and he actually spoke about the idea of de-risking, basically saying, hey, look, why are countries engaged in de-risking, right? This is an enterprise job. Companies should be thinking about it. And when, countries get involved and governments get involved, it gets all mucky and you'll end up actually worsening the problem than what it already is. There is a grain of truth to that, I agree. But he also recognizes the fact that, look, you can't necessarily use de-risking and national security to apply it to everything. Of course, he's conveniently ignoring the fact that Beijing does exactly that. It applies national security to everything nowadays under Xi Jinping's overall national security concept. At the same time, China is also sort of quite aggressively engaged with the global South, right? It's launched these bunch of new initiatives called the Civilization Initiative, Security Initiative, Development Initiative, and each of these is essentially targeted at wooing the global South by saying that, look, this old model that America represents no longer really works. We have a new model. The contours of that model are not unclear, are not necessarily entirely clear, but it's a model which gives everybody room to do everything. It's a model that respects diversity in international relations. So, don't necessarily partner with the Americans because they represent this old road of hegemony, and we don't. So there is this narrative contest, which is to essentially open up space for more partnerships and more economic engagement, more diplomatic engagement, furthering Chinese propositions and Chinese interests. The Americans are engaged in the exact same thing. They have been launching these new mini-lateral groupings from the I2U2 to India, Saudi Arabia, Dubai, UAE, and the US to
Israel.
right now to Israel. No, along with that, there's another one, right? India, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the US, which is talking about a transport corridor. And now you've got this new quad in with the Philippines involved in East Asia. So you're
Yeah.
looking at new frameworks and new partnerships to which can be purposeful, but which can be sort of subject specific, right? Or which can be sort of like special purpose vehicles to achieve certain outcomes. And I think both sides are essentially trying to do that, right? Trying to get more people on their side. I mean, the BRICS, we're going to have the BRICS summit in some time. The idea is to expand the BRICS to include more countries from the global south. So I think that that's the game, right? Right now, we're still very, very early days into what is a long drawn contest that we're going to see. And for all countries, including the United States and China, I think it's useful that the US and China are talking. Even for India, it's useful that the US and China are talking because conflict is in nobody's interest and competition can bring benefits to many.
So I'm going to come to that a little later. You talked about de-risking and decoupling. How do these work? And how do you say that this is de-risking and that is decoupling? And I mean, how does it work? What
Yeah, I
is
mean,
it?
I
I
think,
mean, between them?
yeah, look, I don't think you'd find a singular definition. Which, I mean, if you think of decoupling as essentially broad-based breaking of economic relationships and trying to completely
Which
take
won't
away
happen.
all your, which won't
Yeah.
happen, which is impractical and which is also unnecessary. I think that de-risking is a better frame, a better prism to look at some of this stuff. I would describe de-risking as identifying sectors and subsectors, so areas within sectors, which are of critical importance to national security. Uh, and I define again national security as reasonably broadly. So I would include, say, health security as part of national security. And then trying to see, well, okay, how can I find alternates? How can I assess my dependence in sector A? And how can I find alternate supply chains or alternate means of producing XYZ kind of products? So let's assume that we're talking about pharmaceutical APIs in India's context, right? Around 80% of our pharmaceutical APIs come from China. That's an overwhelming dependence. We need to de-risk in case it gets weaponized, or even if it's not weaponized, in case of some sort of breakdown of systems in China, which lead to disruptions in supplies, which are critical to our national security because health security is there. So we need to find alternates for that. That doesn't mean that we need to stop buying APIs from China. That just means that we need to reduce our dependence, which means that we need to find alternates. Those could be from another market. Those could be domestically created. Those could be by cultivating a new supply chain. Now, in doing that process, I will probably incentivize some companies at home, or I will probably impose some sort of costs on the market that I'm importing from. I will, I may use multiple different tools to try and do that. In that, will it annoy the Chinese? Of course, it will. But it's important for them to understand that, look, I'm not trying to necessarily cut off my trade or decouple. I'm trying to de-risk by creating more alternatives for myself. And in that process, yes, there will be some pain to you and there will be some pain to my exchequer. But my hope is that I will have more alternatives so that I cannot be politically coerced, but also I can have resilience in my supply chain. Now, so this is a basic definition I would apply for de-risking. Now, when you think of it in the context of what Tony Blinken was talking, he talks about advanced technologies, and he says that, well, why would we want to provide advanced technologies that can be used against us? To me, that tells us two things, right? One is that he's looking at certain kinds of technologies in the entire spectrum of available technologies, say within the space of AI, the entire spectrum of what would be classified as AI technologies. He's looking at certain components, certain aspects, certain kinds of research, certain kinds of products, which need not be easily available to an entity that he sees as an adversary. Because when he's telling the Chinese, when he's talking about China and saying that, look, it may be used against us, he's hinting that this is my adversary, which may have hostile intent. And therefore, I need to find a way where I can limit my adversary's access to some of these technologies. So what he's not saying is that I want to block all AI or all semiconductors to you. He's saying that I want to block the highest end that can advance your capabilities to inflict damage upon me. And if you see the semiconductor action that the US took in August 2022, it's essentially that. Now, doing this is difficult because classifying something as critical and strategically important can be extremely difficult, can be extremely sensitive to time, can be extremely sensitive to technological changes, and can be dependent on what your partners are doing because the supply chains are extremely complex. So it's a difficult job to do this. But that's what de-risking, in my mind, would imply, rather than completely shutting down all trade. A good framework for, I think, that one of the frameworks that I've been talking about for some time is that the kind of economic order that we are likely to see going forward um, is, if you can imagine three big football fields or three big yards, right? One of the yards is the biggest. That has your lowest end manufacturing, the most commonplace goods, the chairs we sit on, the couches, the beds we sleep on, all of that stuff. The shoes we wear, the clothes, and all of that. To me, that's an open yard. There's going to be no real fences to that. Economic logic of comparative advantage will work best. Then you have a higher end yard in which there will be some sort of fences, uh, but there will be agency to different actors. This is a yard where you deal with, say, higher end manufacturing capital goods, where you deal with natural resources, because countries which have natural resources have significant say in these sort of markets. And then you come to the highest yard, which is going to be very small with very few players. The core factor of those yards is going to be trust, and there you will see this most sensitive technology, and what is only shared when you have trust, or what is only developed together because you have trust. And I think that's the kind of world that we're heading into, and that's why when I say that the US is engaging in all these different groupings, these are all special purpose vehicles where you have trusts of certain kind, and you're trying to build certain kinds of outcomes which you want to build together to ensure resilience. So to me, that's the kind of world that we're heading into, and that's where de-risking is taking us. It's taking us to some form of segmented globalization.
Now let's look at Modi is heading for the US. Blinken has just come back from Beijing. A certain amount of China-US tensions is good for India, isn't it? I mean, you indirectly mentioned this a little earlier, but this kind of churn in the US-China relationship does help us, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, India in some way has significantly benefited as US-China competition has worsened, because it has deepened the convergence of interests between US and India. And we're seeing the fruits of that over the last few years. That is not to say that there is nothing organic about the India-US relationship.
Yeah,
I mean, the normalization began in late 1990s after the nuclear
it's a
test,
long
and then
haul, yeah.
yeah. So there is an deep organic element to this, but also the fact that uh, the nature of US-China competition and the geopolitics around that has facilitated and enabled a much more faster sort of convergence. So I think we have Xi Jinping to thank for that, for what he did in Ladakh in 2020. But whether this competition between the US and China needs to break out into hostility, and does that benefit us? I don't think so. If it breaks out into conflict, it actually is damaging for us. If it breaks out into zero-sum hostility over issues like Taiwan, it's disadvantageous for us. Just like we saw over the last year, once the war in Ukraine broke out, it became a matter of great diplomatic effort from India's point of view to convince the Americans that, hey, look, we are going to sit on our seat. We don't necessarily endorse this. This is, do we want to be in that position when it comes to Taiwan? We don't. We don't want to be in a position where we want to choose. We want to have most options available to us. And therefore, to do that, it's important that conflict doesn't take place. So this dialogue between the US and China is useful for us, because if it allows tensions to be contained, yet it allows competition to continue. It's beneficial for us because this competition is enabling the United States to invest more of its eggs in the India basket, and I think that's
So
something that's positive
we
for
would
us.
like things to simmer, isn't it, Manoj? Things to be on a slow boil kind of thing. That helps us,
Yeah,
and the
indeed.
more that continues, the longer that continues, the better.
Indeed, I think that simmering competition, and competition particularly of an economic nature that we are seeing with this de-risking business, which truly benefits us because we are in a position where we are cultivating trust with the Americans. The fact that we are getting this jet engine deal right now
Yeah.
is big, is significant, right? It tells you that there is the kind of trust which the US has not reposed in any other non-treaty ally. So it just tells you the kind of benefits that we are going to be able to get if these tensions continue to simmer. But it is important for those tensions to not boil over, and for that, this dialogue is useful, right? So from an Indian point of view, I would also look at this dialogue and say this is helpful, this is beneficial. We don't want to see the US and China engaging in some sort of a G2 formulation.
Yeah.
That seems highly unlikely.
Highly
Uh,
unlikely.
so I'm sure that people in India, when they watch this, they'll be sort of anxious about that. But again, to me, that's a misreading of the way domestic politics in the United States today is, and even Chinese perceptions of the US today are. That I don't think trust is there for that to happen. But it's useful for dialogue to happen so that you don't end up seeing accidental escalations, you don't end up seeing conflict, and you don't end up seeing foolhardy economic policies also, which can then adversely affect us.
So, last question. How would you see Beijing reacting to how India and the US are currently dealing? Kind of, does it revive their worst fears about, the engine deal and all that? The UAV deal tells China that there's something happening which they will not like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there will be a great deal of discomfort, and there will also be a great deal of cynicism. Like I said, I think when Antony Blinken talks about the fact that he went to disabuse the Chinese of the notion that there is no effort at containment, particularly from an economic point of view,
Yeah.
I don't think the Chinese are buying that. There are some. The Biden administration has added some, I don't know, 70 or 100 odd companies on the entity list, Chinese companies on the entity list. Plus, you're now investing in India. Your Indo-Pacific strategy explicitly talks about supporting India's rise as a major power in this region, and China sees the Indo-Pacific strategy as fundamentally an effort at containment. That's what that's what Chinese media tells us. And Wang Yi told Antony Blinken that if you want to really engage with us, then by the time the APEC summit comes, why don't you rethink your Indo-Pacific strategy, because your so-called Indo-Pacific strategy is fundamentally nothing other than containment.
Containing.
So I think they'll be watching this visit with a great deal of discomfort and a great deal of frustration. Um, I think it's also worth noting that there is a reason why we have not seen an effort from Beijing to try and reach out to India. In the
Yeah.
last six months to a year, we have seen outreach to the United States, we have seen outreach to Japan, we have seen outreach to Australia. We
Yeah.
have not seen outreach to India at all. To me, it is quite remarkable that the Indian Prime Minister and the Chinese President have had no one-on-one direct conversation since
Yeah.
October 2019, since the second informal summit. And there has been no effort to also have that conversation. Have there been some letters exchanged that we know of? Yes, those are perfunctory letters. Most recently, after the train collision in Orissa, you
Yeah.
had a letter from the Chinese president expressing condolences. There was an opportunity for a dialogue, but I don't think that's taken place. And that's purposeful, that's by design. Therefore, I don't think that Beijing sees the opportunity. Beijing would look at this particular visit and see a much more potentially aggressive and hostile India in its perception, a much more emboldened India, willing to continue to sort of face off against the Chinese, rather than it would see the fact that, look, this is an opportunity for us also to perhaps have an outreach opportunity and reach out to the Indians and see if they are interested. There
So the
have been
lack,
opportunities for that.
so
I
the
mean,
lack of
if I could
outreach,
just add,
the lack of
yeah, if I could,
outreach, Manoj, does
hmm.
that tell you something about how they see us?
Yeah, I think it does. I think that it's really interesting that we're not seeing the SCO summit happen in person. We are seeing
Yeah.
the SCO summit happen virtually. The two leaders will likely be there for the BRICS summit in South Africa. That's if it takes place in South Africa, or if it gets moved to China. Um, if it gets moved to China, it'd be interesting to see if the Prime Minister travels to China. But I think that's another interesting. But I think the lack of outreach is fundamentally a product of a view that that India is fundamentally trying to leverage the situation and seeking opportunities to get closer to the United States, while therefore putting pressure on China. And Beijing therefore
India's
needs
bad
to
boy.
continue to engage. Yeah, and India needs that Beijing therefore needs to continue to engage India from a position of strength rather than reconciliation. I think that one sort of last thing that I would add to this is that we're right now waiting for these couple of summits to happen. In the meantime, in the backdrop, you've had the G20 meetings happening, and from what I
Yeah.
understand, the Chinese have not been, while they've not necessarily disrupted the summit process, they have not been the most cooperative. Whether it comes at different working groups meetings, or whether it comes at, say, the meeting in Kashmir, the meeting in Arunachal,
Yeah.
they've
Yeah.
not been the most cooperative, and they've been quite publicly critical. And even when it comes to issuance of certain statements, they have stood by the Russians, and India has had to eventually issue chair statements acknowledging the disagreements. So I don't think
Yeah.
they've necessarily been terribly cooperative. And to me, all of this is a pattern of hostility towards India, because they perceive India as a power that potentially plays a spoiler role for their rise, but also potentially as a power which is seeking to gain advantage by balancing against China by getting closer to the United States.
So hard decisions ahead in the next few months as we go forward. Manoj, thanks very much. Good insight. And let's see where we are going with China. I mean, G20 is there, SEO is there. Probably nothing very much will emerge from there, from either of the summits. Manoj, thanks very much.
Thank you so much. If I could just end with the fact that I think there are so many opportunities, but so little being taken.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks very much, Manoj. So, those of you who tune into this conversation, do subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media and Twitter. And thank you very much. Good night.